Hello again, folks. This is Lynette coming to you from Christian Roots Canada. And today I want to continue with the stories about the kings of France and their terrible deaths. And they have had a history of persecuting the church, persecuting Christians. And the reason this is important, I would repeat, is because they form a part of our history that has not been told before. Now, we know that because of the marble frieze that is mounted over the left doorway of the House of Commons, and it shows Francis I on one side and Louis XIV on the other side. And their reign started from 1515 and ended in 1715. So that's 200 years of history. And it's quite interesting to see that the persecution of the Protestants began under Francis I, and it continued successively under every one of the rulers, his progeny, until Louis XIV. So today I want to recap again what happened to those kings. And some of them, you would see that their history parallels the history of some of the kings of Israel, or some of the stories that we read about in Judges. So I want to start again and recap what happened from Francis I until Louis XIV. And I'll probably repeat this again sometime when it's necessary. So let's begin again with the information from Francis I. Now, Francis I, he started the persecution against the Protestants, and he instituted the burning at the stakes because he couldn't, the persecution of the Protestants initiated Calvin leaving France and going to Geneva, and the growth of the church through that. I'm reading right now a book on the history of the rise of the Huguenots, and there are some other stories which are really, really heartbreaking. After I do this recap of how the kings died, I will go through some of those stories and share some of those stories with you. So let's look at Francis I again and remember that he passed away in 1547 after a severe fever. And when the doctors opened his body, they discovered that there was an abscess in his stomach, his kidneys had shriveled, his entrails were putrefied, his throat corroded, and one of his lungs was in shreds. So that's Francis I. Now, Francis had started the extreme persecution of the Huguenots, the Protestants, and he left the groundwork for Henry II, his son, to continue that. Now, in this book that I have been reading about the history of the rise of the Huguenots, it tells about why Henry persecuted the Protestants with such vigor. One of the stories that for the first time, I really understood what kind of hold that Diane de Poitiers had on Henry II. It was because she was benefiting, she was encouraging the persecution of the Huguenots, so that when their property was confiscated, she benefited by receiving some of the proceeds of what they owned, because it says in this book that her sons were held in I think in Spain, because of the war. They were prisoners of war, and she was raising funds to free her sons from prison, raising the ransom money by profiting off the persecution of the Protestants. And Anne de Montmorency, who was the Constable of France at the time, he had been fired by Francis, but he was rehired by Henry II, and he also profited off the loss of property of the Protestants. So they were becoming rich by persecuting especially the royal noblemen and people of high estate who had been professing the Protestant faith. So Henry, he died in 1559 from a jousting match. And what happened is that his opponent's lance struck him in the eye and pierced his eyeball straight into his brain, penetrated his brain. That happened on the 30th of June, and by the 10th of July, he had passed away. Next in line for the throne was his son Francis II, who was very sickly. And so Henry died in 1559 and Francis died 1 year later. Now, if you remember the importance of Francis to the Reformation, Francis was married to Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's mother was Mary of Guise, who was married to James V of Scotland. So she was the regent for Scotland. When James V died, Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to the French courts to be raised because Mary of Guise was the sister to Francis of Guise, who was also Henry's good buddy. So Henry II's good buddy. So Mary, Queen of Scots, she was 16 years old when she got married, and when Francis died, she was 18, and she had to go back to Britain, where she had to compete with her sister, her half-sister Elizabeth I, for ruling over Scotland. Now, if you were to go to Netflix and you would watch Elizabeth I, there is a whole lot of truth in the story of Elizabeth I. Or even if you watch Mary, Queen of Scots, you would see the dynamics that played out in the courts at that time. So those are two Netflix movies that you can watch. After Francis II died in 1560, Charles II came on the throne. Now remember, Charles II came on the throne during the time that Jean d'Albret was the leader of the Protestant, the Huguenot army, and the Protestant wars. Jean d'Albret was the Queen of Navarre, and her son was Henry III of Navarre. Now, because Henry II had left France in such a state of persecution and problems for the Protestants, the Huguenots, Catherine de' Medici, who was the mom of Francis II, who passed away with an ear inflammation. So he passed away. Catherine de' Medici was the regent on his behalf, on his behalf, and then she continued to be regent for her successive minor sons who came to the throne. So Catherine de Medici is also still regent now for her son Charles IX. Catherine de Medici wanted to relieve the Protestants of all the persecution that they were having. She kicked Diane de Poitiers out of the court as soon as Henry II died, and stripped her of all the privileges that she had. And now, in sympathy to the persecution that the Protestants were having, Catherine de Medici is now ruling again on behalf of Charles IX. And so he is on the throne from 1561, and that's the point in time. 1560 is when Jean d'Albret says, my country of Navarre is a Calvinist country. And then Catherine appoints Antoine to be the Constable of France, which he took over from Anne de Montmorency. And then in 1561, when Catherine had passed that edict of tolerance to give the Protestants a breather, Francis of Guise, Protestants were allowed now to worship, but as long as they did that in the barns and outside of the city. And Francis of Guise initiated the French Wars of Religion in 1561 by coming upon those Protestants praying, having their service in the barn, and then he invaded the barn with his entourage, and they burnt the barn down, killing 60 people and wounding 100. So here is Catherine in the middle of all of this, ruling for her son, Charles IX. It was under Charles IX that Henry of Navarre was married to Catherine's daughter, Marguerite of Valois. So all of this is happening under Charles IX. And then came the massacre, the St. Bartholomew Days massacre in 1572. Well, 2 years later, in 1574, Charles IX died of tuberculosis, and he had no legitimate heir. So that's when his brother, Henry III, became king. Now remember the last time I told you about Henry III, he was leading the war against the Protestants in La Rochelle in 1574, when he was called away to be the king of Poland. So he signed a peace treaty and he went away to be king. And while he was there, his younger brother, Hercule Francois, Duke of Anjou, he fell ill and he died of malaria. So there was nobody else to take the throne, and Catherine called Henry back to France, saying, France needs you. So he leaves the throne, he gives up the throne in Poland, comes back to France, and then because he continued to negotiate with the Protestants so that they would have some freedom, he signed some freedoms for them. That initiated the Catholic League, wanting to protect the Catholic Church and the Catholic doctrines. And in the process of all of that, the way it worked out is that Henry III ended up killing off the Guise brothers who were initiating the persecution and did not like Henry giving any privileges to the Protestants. So Henry III was in trouble. So his opponents were gaining the upper hand, and they were basically ruling France in his place, because they were marshalling help from Spain and help from the Pope and everything else. The Pope, the Charles V and Rome, to help them fight against the Protestants gaining any foothold in France. So Henry eliminated his opponents, and then while he was fighting against the Catholic League, he needed help. So he called on Henry III of Navarre to come and help him gain back Paris and take control of France from the Catholic League. So Henry III of France was fighting. Henry III of Navarre was helping Henry III of France to take back Paris, when a monk came to his tent where they were stationed, and he said he had a message, a private message for the king, for Henry III. So he approached Henry III with some papers, and in the papers he had a dagger, and so he killed Henry III by slicing his stomach open and his entrails falling out. So now Henry III is assassinated, and the person that is next in line for the throne is Henry III of Navarre, who now becomes Henry IV of France. Now, one of the things you need to understand is that the Catholic nobles and the Catholic League, they recognized that all of the other legitimate heirs of the throne were now dead, and there was no one after Henry III of France. They were trying to stop Henry III of Navarre from becoming king in case Henry III died. But when they orchestrated the assassination of Henry III of France, in God's providence, they initiated the very thing they did not want. So Henry III of Navarre now became Henry IV of France. And Henry IV of France continued to fight the Catholic League for a long time, for about 5 years, before he was accepted as Henry IV of France, because they just did not want a Protestant king sitting on a Catholic throne. Henry IV of France, now in an effort to bring peace to his country, he subsequently married another de Medici from Italy, and her name was Marie de Medici. Marie de Medici and Henry IV of France bore Louis XIII. Louis XIII, he continued the persecution of the Huguenots, the Protestants, and it was under Louis XIII that the city of La Rochelle, the walled Protestant city, was destroyed under the leadership of Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, whose name was Armand Duplessis. Armand Duplessis, or Cardinal Richelieu, was given a lot of privileges in New France, So that's why Richelieu is a name that is associated with Quebec. If you understood how things turned out with Quebec, all of Ontario and Quebec was the province, at one time was the province of Quebec. All of that was New France. So Cardinal Richelieu made his name there. And Louis XIII, so how did he die? He died of tuberculosis. And with the tuberculosis, his intestines were inflamed and ulcerated, making digestion virtually impossible. The tuberculosis had spread to his lungs, and it was accompanied by habitual cough. Louis XIII was only 41 years old at the time of his death. So we see a pattern of these kings being, the Lord inflicting horrible, painful deaths on these kings who are a part of our history, because of the fact that you can find that marble frieze mounted over the left doorway of the House of Commons, and you can find pictures of all of these kings displayed in the Senate foyer in the Senate building where they are meeting right now, in the old train building at the corner of Wellington and Elgin Streets in Ottawa. So look at how these kings all died very painful deaths. After Louis XIII, he had young children also when he died. Louis XIV actually was his only son at that time, his oldest son, and his mother ruled on his behalf. His mother got help from Cardinal Mazarin to continue to persecute Protestants. Under Louis XIV, Louis had boasted that when he took the throne, there were about 1 million Protestants in France. And in about a year or so, there was only about 1,500. So severe was the persecution. Under Louis XIV, a number of things happened. The Protestants were skilled laborers who were skilled artisans and held a lot of the upper middle class jobs. They had businesses, and they were part of the economic engine of France. But under Louis XIV, all of Europe benefited from his persecution of the Huguenots, because those Protestants left and they went to Britain, they went to Holland, they went to Amsterdam, they went to various places in Europe, and they became the top craftsmen in those places. And we will deal with that when we come to Louis XIV. Now, Louis XIV also died a horrible death. It is said that he had many ailments. For example, he had symptoms of diabetes. He also had a bone disease that was a kind of inflammation along the bone. He had dental abscesses. He had recurring boils. He had fainting spells. He had gout. He had dizziness. He had hot flushes. He had headaches. And by 1686, he developed a painful anal fistula, which was inflamed with pus, and then he was confined a lot to bed because that fistula discharged unpleasant intestinal contents into the bed and the room, so it was terrible. Surgery became necessary. And for the surgery, it is said that in 1715, he developed pain in his leg, and the doctors thought that it was sciatica. Well, then a black spot appeared on his leg, and the doctors tried many remedies, but nothing helped. And they realized that it was gangrene. What was called gangrene is called today as flesh-eating disease. So that spread to his thigh, and it is said that he died 4 days before his 77th birthday. Now, one of the reports on his death says that enduring much pain in his last days, he finally yielded up his soul without any effort, like a candle going out, while reciting the Psalm 70, verse 1, "O Lord, make haste to help me." So even in death, people who are persecutors acknowledge death, and it is interesting that most people, even if they rail against God and they hate God in their life, when they're in pain, they cry out to God. So there I've given you an entire overview of how the kings from Francis I to Louis the 14th died. They all died painful deaths.
To learn more about the Christian roots of Canada's history, visit our website at christianrootscanada.org.